March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The oxygen mask froze against Major Hans Kugler's face as he scanned the clear, icy sky through the canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, leading his mixed fighter formation toward the bomber stream that his ground controllers claimed would be unescorted at this altitude, this deep into the Reich, Hakong, Indiana at 12 o'clock high. Single-engine fighters with drop tanks. The warning crackled through his headset with rising panic. Kugler felt his blood turn to ice. American fighters, single-engine fighters here over Brandenburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin. It seemed impossible. No Allied single-engine aircraft had the range to reach this deep into Germany and return to England. The maximum escort capability of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was Aachen, barely crossing into German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could manage Hanover on a good day. But Brandenburg or Berlin itself, this shattered every estimate, every assumption, every defensive strategy the Luftwaffe had built since the American daylight bombing campaign began. As Kugler watched the silver shapes grow larger, their squared wingtips and sleek lines becoming unmistakable, he understood with chilling clarity that he was witnessing the beginning of the end. These were not stubby Thunderbolts or twin-boom Lightnings they had learned to engage at extreme range. These were North American P-51 Mustangs, and they moved through the air with the relaxed confidence of hunters who knew they had fuel to spare, altitude in hand. And all the time they needed to kill. 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were closing on Berlin. Not the usual feint toward the capital before diverting to secondary targets, but a direct strike at the heart of the Third Reich. And for the first time in aviation history, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way in and all the way back. What Kugler and his combined group of 7 twin-engine Me-110s and 41 Me-109s did not realize was that this moment would trigger the deepest psychological collapse in the history of air warfare. A total destruction not only of aircraft and pilots, but of the belief system that had upheld German air superiority since 1939. That arithmetic of annihilation was being written, not in the conference rooms of the Air Ministry, but in the contrails. Streaking across the Brandenburg sky at 28,000 feet, the shock had actually begun weeks earlier, though few in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the evidence. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf of JG-11 had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they were believed able to reach. His after-action report, suggesting these fighters must have refueled at hidden bases in Sweden, was dismissed in Berlin as fatigue-clouding judgment. But sightings increased Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each report expanded the known American fighter range further east, and each was met with official denial. The Reich Air Ministry issued an order on February 15th, firmly stating that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications of P-38s or friendly aircraft. Pilots making such claims would face medical evaluation. The reality was far more disturbing than secret Swedish bases or pilot delusions. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what German experts had called physically impossible, extending the P-51 Mustang's combat radius to over 650 miles, with disposable auxiliary fuel tanks. The math appeared to defy the laws of aerodynamics. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel for a 1,300-mile flight while retaining combat performance was, according to German calculations, impossible. Hauptmann Heinz Knock, commanding the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944, we calculated precisely. The American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from England, no farther. This left us all of central and eastern Germany as hunting grounds where we could attack the bombers without interference. It was basic arithmetic: fuel capacity divided by consumption. The Americans could not break the laws of physics. But the Americans had not broken physics. They had applied it more cleverly than anyone in German command imagined. The secret was not in the aircraft alone, but in two revolutionary developments that German intelligence had missed or dismissed as propaganda: the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard V16503 engine was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an enhanced version built to higher tolerances, using mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automobile factories. It delivered 1,490 horsepower at sea level and, crucially, over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical specialist with JG-26, inspected a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, reveals German disbelief. The engine installation is a marvel of efficiency. The intercooler system alone is more advanced than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605, but most remarkable is the manufacturing quality. Every part is machined with jeweler's precision. Yet they claim the Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If this is true, this war is not between pilots, but between assembly lines. The drop tanks were an even simpler triumph. Made from molded paper soaked in resin, these 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds empty, lighter than the ammunition load of one Mustang machine gun. Designed by British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the laminated construction could hold fuel for around 5 hours, before beginning to degrade more than enough for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had tried auxiliary tanks too, but their metal versions were heavy, costly, and designed for reuse, worsening performance and making the aircraft vulnerable. The American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon tanks could fly to Berlin, drop them instantly when combat began, and fight at full capability. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zenk of the 56th Fighter Group explained the tactical shift in a 1944 briefing. The Germans expected us to conserve fuel for combat and the return flight. But with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires. Cruise to Berlin on externals, drop them, and still have enough internal fuel for 30 minutes of full-throttle combat, plus the trip home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore, we had margin to spend. To grasp the psychological blow of March 6, 1944, one must understand the trauma of October 14, 1943 Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force attempted to bomb the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories without long-range escort. Of 291 B-17s that entered German airspace, 60 were lost and 138 damaged, a 20.6% loss rate with more than 600 aircrew casualties. The Luftwaffe proved that unescorted daylight raids were unsustainable. General I.R. Aker suspended deep raids. Generalmajor Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe fighter chief, called October 14th the greatest victory of Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. In his memoir The First and the Last, he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we believed we had shown daylight precision bombing was hopeless. The Americans would have to follow the British into night raids where accuracy was impossible and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle." But Galland, skilled tactician though he was, made a critical misjudgment. He assumed the Americans would accept technological limits rather than innovate. When reports of a new long-range fighter reached him in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of imagining things. Only on February 20, 1944, the start of Big Week, did Galland recognize the scale of the threat. The Americans sent 1,000 bombers with 835 fighters, including the first large deployment of P-51BS, in 5 days. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and, more importantly, 100 veteran pilots, 17% of their experienced force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf's younger brother, commanding 3 JG-26, reported after Big Week, "The appearance of Mustangs changed everything. Before, we could wait beyond fighter range and hit the bombers methodically. Now we had to punch through escorts to reach the bombers, then fight our way out again. Every mission became a struggle to survive from takeoff to landing. The morning of March 6, 1944, broke clear and cold over Northern Europe, ideal flying weather. At RAF Leiston in England, ground crews worked through the night preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet, the first P-51 unit to escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer briefed his pilots at 0600, "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B the whole way. We'll be over enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who doubts his aircraft is perfect should abort now. At these ranges, there are no second chances." None aborted. Ironically, Spicer himself aborted after takeoff due to mechanical failure, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to lead the historic mission. At 8:30, 730, heavy bombers began taking off from East Anglia bases. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared for relay escort, P-47s for initial penetration, P-38s for mid-course, and P-51s for the deepest escort. The 357th launched 48 P-51BS, though only 33 would reach Berlin due to mechanical issues and navigation problems in heavy cloud. In Germany, Reich Air Defense Radar picked up the formation over the North Sea. At Doberitz, Berlin's main fighter control center, analysts assumed another feint. The Americans had approached before, only to swing away toward western targets. Oberst Hans Trautloft, commanding Berlin's defense, made a crucial call: he would hold his fighters until the bombers committed. No point wasting fuel if this was another diversion. At 11:30, the lead bombers entered German airspace near Arnhem. The escorting P-47s clashed with German fighters rising from Holland and western bases. The pattern seemed unchanged. Luftwaffe pilots fought cautiously, waiting for the moment when the Americans would surely turn back at fuel limit. At 12:55, as the bomber stream neared Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed force to intercept what they thought would be unprotected bombers. His group consisted of 7 Me-110s forced into daytime use and 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers had tracked the P-47s, turning back and believed the bombers exposed. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 357th 33 Mustangs that had reached Berlin through heavy weather, later said in his combat report, "We broke through the clouds to see B-24 Liberators below and left. At the same moment, we saw about 40 enemy fighters setting up for attack. Me-110s and Me-109s. They hadn't spotted us. We held altitude advantage and total surprise." The German group, concentrating fully on the bombers, never saw the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes dove on them, calling out, "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock low, drop tanks and attack." Feldwebel Jan Muller of JG-11, flying one of the escorting Bf-109s, survived and later said, "We were perfectly placed, just beginning our attack dive. We were just starting our attack run on the bombers when tracer fire flashed past my canopy. I glanced up and saw single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It seemed impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these had to be captured planes, some kind of trick. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and I understood these were real American fighters with a range we had never thought possible. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. The German fighters, completely surprised and badly positioned, broke formation and scattered in panic. In just 12 minutes of fighting, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down ABF 109 at low level near Welsen, then led other Mustangs in strafing a German airfield dot at his estate at Karenhall, 50 miles north of Berlin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was eating lunch when the call came from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin. Single-engine fighters. "You are mistaken, Galland," Göring said calmly. "Check your reports again." "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are fighting our units over Potsdam right now." Göring's anger exploded. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was present, the Reichsmarschall hurled his wine glass at the wall and shouted, "This is treason, sabotage!" The pilots are lying to hide their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed. But even as Göring raged, the proof was all around him. From his own estate he could see the contrails above Berlin and hear the distant roar of engines at full power. His aide later said that Göring stood at the window for nearly an hour, staring at the sky in silence. That evening, Göring issued his most notorious order of the air war. Any pilot who claimed to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin was to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American single-engine fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact. The order caused chaos in fighter units already shaken by losses. Pilots who had just fought P-51s were now threatened with court-martial for telling the truth. Several squadron leaders, including Major Georg Röhl, simply ignored the order and told their men to report twin-engine fighters in their combat records. Generalmajor Galland, during a tense meeting at the Air Ministry on March 8, placed a fragment of a P-51 drop tank in front of Göring, clearly marked Made in USA and found near Magdeburg. Göring's reply became Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a complete Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It is scientifically impossible." It was at that moment, according to Galland's memoirs, that he knew Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Göring admitted, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the game was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the Mustangs over Berlin were not just a tactical surprise but a personal crisis. These men had been told again and again that they guarded an unbreakable fortress, that German science and engineering were better than anything the Allies had. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, commanding 2, Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We always knew where we were safe, where we could regroup, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological shock was intensified by how superior the P-51B was. It was not just present over Berlin. It was in control. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, compared with the Bf-109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same height. Its laminar flow wing gave it excellent handling at high altitude. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered deadly concentrated fire, and most important of all, its pilots were still fresh, not exhausted from long flights at the edge of their fuel. Unteroffizier Vera Peck of JG 301 survived a fight with P-51s on March 9th and described it. They came from above and behind, always with more altitude. When we tried to turn toward them, they climbed straight up. They had the power to go vertical whenever they wanted. When we tried to dive away, they stayed with us easily. They flew like they had endless fuel, making several attacks, following us down to low level. We were used to American fighters that had to watch their fuel, that made one pass and went home. These Mustangs played with us like cats with mice. Johann Steinhoff, commander of JG 77, later wrote about the change in strategy. We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort, even when we could not see them. No more large, carefully formed attacks, no more taking time to maneuver into the best position. We had to attack at once with whatever we had, accept higher losses, and hope to hit the bombers before the Mustangs found us. The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin came just as another slow disaster was reaching a breaking point: fuel. Germany had always relied on synthetic fuel, turning coal into aviation gasoline with the Bergius hydrogenation process. This needed huge plants that were easy targets for accurate bombing. Before March 1944, these plants were almost untouched. They were too far from England for precise attacks with escort. The logic was simple. Without fighters, bombers could not stay over the target long enough to bomb accurately, and without accuracy, the thick concrete of the hydrogenation plants would probably survive. The Mustang overturned this logic at once. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force mounted its first major raid against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, with 735 fighters, 298 of them P-51s, dropped 1,718 tons of bombs with deadly precision. Luna's output fell by 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had dropped from 175,000 tons a month to 35,000 tons. By September, it had fallen to 7,000 tons, barely enough to support 500 sorties a day on all fronts combined. Training flights were canceled completely. New pilots were going into battle with as little as 50 total flying hours, compared to the 250 hours that had been standard in 1942. Veteran who had transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich Defense described the decline. By summer 1944, we were allowed one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived who had never fired their guns in the air, never flown real formation, never practiced mock combat. They were lambs led to slaughter. What we lacked was not only fuel. We lacked experience, confidence, everything that turns a man into a fighter pilot. The full effect of the Mustang was revealed on June 6, 1944 D-Day. The largest seaborne invasion in history depended on total Allied control of the air over the beaches. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe managed 319, losing 35 aircraft. Over the actual landing zones, only 2 German fighters appeared the entire day. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, flew the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches. With his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Waterchick, he made one strafing pass on Sword Beach before being driven off by Spitfires. In his memoir, Priller wrote, 2 aircraft. That was all we could send against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel. We lacked aircraft, and above all, we lacked control of the sky. The Mustangs had taken that from us months earlier. Not over Normandy, but over Berlin. Major whirl. who had led 3 JG-54 and shot down a P-51 on May 24, 1944, summed up the strategic situation. After the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we never again held the initiative. We were always answering, always on defense, always outnumbered. The Americans could hit any target at any time with full fighter cover. We could barely protect our own runways. The air war was lost the day they could fly Mustangs over Berlin. Driven to extremes, the Luftwaffe began using increasingly suicidal methods. The Sturmgruppen assault concept was the clearest sign of this desperation. FW-19OA-8s were fitted with extra armor, 30mm cannons, and stronger windscreens. These flying battering rams were meant to break through the fighters and attack the bombers at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who took command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous supporter of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led IV Sturm JG-3, backed by 2 Gruppen of Bf-109s from JG-300, in a huge attack on B-24 Liberators near Leipzig. The armored FW-190s managed to wipe out one entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in under a minute, but the price was terrible. Of the Sturmgruppe aircraft that took off, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The escorting Bf-109s suffered even heavier losses against the Mustangs. The methods that briefly worked in July soon became pure suicide as American fighter numbers soared. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturmgruppe pilots to live through several missions, described it: "We were flying coffins. The armor that was meant to save us made us so slow that the Mustangs could make several firing runs whenever they liked. The order was to ram if our guns failed. But how could we ram when we could not even reach the bombers through the fighter swarm? Every mission was Russian roulette with all the chambers loaded." Germany's final hope rested on a leap in technology, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, it was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of ace pilots, it might have changed the air war. But the Me-262 arrived too late and in too small numbers. Worse, Hitler's demand that it be used as a fighter bomber instead of an interceptor wasted months. By the time enough jets were allowed to fly fighter missions in late 1944, the Luftwaffe had too little fuel to train pilots properly and too few safe airfields to operate from. Adolf Galland, removed as General der Jagdflieger for criticizing Hitler, was put in charge of GV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945, even with Germany's best surviving pilots, flying the most advanced fighter in the world. They could not break the overwhelming Allied advantage. Galland said of this period, "We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters, and return only to find our airfield under Mustang attack. They hunted us during takeoff and landing, when jets were most helpless. For every minute we spent in the air, Mustangs were above us for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and organization is nothing." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was suffering what historians later called the death of the experts. The seasoned aces, many with dozens or even hundreds of kills, were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Mustangs deep over Germany meant there were no safe rear areas to train in, no quiet sectors where beginners could learn. The statistics are brutal. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received about 250 flying hours before combat. By 1944, this had dropped to 80 hours. By early 1945, some were sent to the front with only 20 hours in their operational type dot at the same time. American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flying. including 100 hours on their combat aircraft and extensive gunnery practice. Johann Steinhoff, who suffered severe burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later said, "We were sending children to die." Boys who could barely stay in formation were expected to fight Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It was not battle, it was murder. I stopped looking at the faces of the replacements. I knew most would be dead in a week. The casualty figures confirm this. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units saw complete turnover in a single month. JG 301, once a top unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945 while claiming only 41 victories. Lieutenant Go, who survived the war with 3 victories, described a new pilot's experience. "My first mission was supposed to be a training patrol over Brunswick with experienced men. We were bounced by Mustangs before we had even formed up properly. My leader died in the first attack. I never saw the Mustang that fired at me, only the tracers streaking past my canopy. I dropped to treetop height and flew home alone. That was my combat training." While the Luftwaffe was being drained in the air, American bombing was systematically destroying German aircraft production. The Mustang's long reach meant no factory was safe anymore. The big centers at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit again and again with deadly accuracy. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, later testified, "The Mustang allowed the Americans to keep constant pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a plant, restart production, and within days it would be wrecked again. We began moving factories into caves and forests, but this raised costs and cut efficiency by 75%. We were building more fighters in 1944 than in 1943. But we could not build them fast enough to make. Up for losses, and we had neither fuel to fly them nor trained pilots to use them. The figures support this grim picture. German fighter production peaked at 33 aircraft in September 1944. But losses that month were 3,217. The Luftwaffe was literally losing planes faster than one of the world's most efficient industrial systems could build them. At the same time, the quality of rushed aircraft from scattered factories was falling. Engine failures, weak structures, and constant system problems plagued the new machines. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked by what he saw. Aircraft were arriving with serious flaws. Engines that should have lasted 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were sticking. Guns were not aligned correctly. "We had gone from building the world's best fighters," he said, "to pushing out flying coffins. The workers were exhausted, the materials were poor, and there was no real testing. We were destroying ourselves." On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a huge surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, almost all the remaining strength of the Luftwaffe in the West, took off at dawn. Many pilots were flying their first combat mission. Most had never flown in formations larger than 4 aircraft. The plan was so secret that German flak units were not informed, causing deadly friendly fire. The strike achieved total surprise. 305 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground and 190 damaged. But the price was terrible. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and, even worse, 213 pilots, including many leaders who could not be replaced. 3 Geschwader-Kommen, 6 Gruppencommander, and 14 Staffelkapitän were killed or captured. Oberleutnant Jan Kogler, who survived, called it the Luftwaffe's death ride. "We destroyed aircraft the Americans replaced in a week," he said. "We lost pilots we could never replace. Worse, we burned our last fuel reserves. After Bodenplatte, we were finished. We could no longer even pretend to challenge the sky." The American reaction was fast and merciless. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps were systematically hunting down the weakened German fighter units. Airfields were strafed again and again. In the week after Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground. Major John Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, with 24 victories, described the period after Bodenplatte. "It was almost sad. We'd find German airfields full of airplanes that could not fly because there was no fuel. We'd strafe them, they would burn, and no one came up to fight. It was no longer combat. It was execution." As 1945 went on, the Luftwaffe stopped existing as a real fighting force. Individual pilots still flew individual missions, but organized operations were no longer possible. The arrival of Mustangs over any German airfield usually meant destruction. Pilots began refusing to fly, not from fear, but from the clear understanding that taking off meant almost certain death with no real chance of changing the war. The mental strain was enormous. Heinz Nock, who had once written proudly about defending the Reich, made his final diary entry, "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers, all dead. For what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The Luftwaffe's own records, captured after the war, show the truth in cold figures. January 1944 to 2,395 fighter pilots. Ready for combat. June 1944. 1,523 fighter pilots. Ready. D-Day. January 1945. 742 fighter pilots ready. April 1945, about 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots who were operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% finished the war unhurt. The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin had started a complete destruction that wiped out almost an entire generation of German airmen. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots spoke very openly about the Mustang's effect. Their statements, gathered by Allied intelligence and later historians, give a clear view into the mental collapse of a force that had once ruled the skies. Adolf Galland, despite being fired and clashing with Nazi leaders, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat. In a 1954 interview, he said, "The P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. It was not the best fighter in every single area. The Spitfire could turn better. The FW-190 rolled better. The Me-262 was faster, but the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere." Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your enemy suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board. Johann Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945 and later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, was just as direct. "The Mustang didn't just beat the Luftwaffe," he said. "It destroyed the very idea of German control of the air. We had built our entire defensive plan on the belief that Germany itself was beyond the reach of single-engine fighters. When that belief proved wrong, everything fell apart. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was a strategic disaster from which we never recovered." Perhaps the most moving words came from Heinz Nock, whose diary had recorded the whole path from confidence to despair. At a 1975 reunion of former enemies, he met Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. Noak told him, "You must understand, when we first saw your Mustangs over Berlin, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us. Then suddenly you were over our capital with fuel to spare. It broke something inside us. Not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told." Eric Hartmann, history's top-scoring ace with 352 victories, survived by creating his own anti-Mustang tactics. He attacked only when he had every possible advantage and broke off at once if Mustangs appeared. In his post-war talks, he admitted, "Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we had known it. It was survival. They had every advantage: numbers, height, fuel, and more pilot quality. We could only hope to stay alive and maybe surprise a straggler." The Mustang's effect on the European air war can also be seen in numbers, showing both the scale of American success and the depth of German defeat. Aircraft. DESTROYED P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 aerial victories in Europe, plus another 4,131 aircraft destroyed on the ground. This was 48.9% of all U.S. Army Air Force's fighter claims in the European theater. Loss. RATIOS P-51 combat loss rate, 1.2%. Per sortie. Luftwaffe fighter loss rate by 1,945, 18% per sortie. Overall kill ratio, about 3.6 to 1 in favor of the P-51. Bomber protection before. The Mustang. Bomber loss rate 9.1% per mission. After. The Mustang. Bomber loss rate 2.5% per mission. Cut in bomber crew. Casualties 68%. Range revolution 47. Thunderbolt combat radius 375. MILES P-38 Lightning combat radius 450. MILES P-51 BC Mustang combat radius 650. Miles with drop tanks. P-51D. Mustang combat radius 750 miles with drop tanks. Percentage of German territory within P-51. Range 100%. Production supremacy total P-51S. Built 15,686. Peak output 320 per month. Cost per aircraft 1,945. $51,000. German fighter production in 1,944, 25,860. Yet the number of German fighters actually ready at any one time was never more than 1,500. Pilot. Attrition: American pilots arriving in Europe in 1,944 to 45, on average 400 flight hours. German pilots entering combat in 1,944 to 45, on average 80 flight hours. LUFTWAFFE pilot survival rate 1,940-45, under 15%. American fighter pilot tour completion rate 65%. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin was more than a simple battlefield success. It was a revolution in air power. For the first time, one country could project decisive air strength over every part of another major power's territory. The impact went far beyond World War II. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, wrote in his final report, "The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe, not air superiority, which suggests a continuing struggle, but air supremacy, total control. By spring 1944, we could hit any target at any time with acceptable losses." This was not only a military advantage but a psychological weapon. German morale, in the armed forces and among civilians, collapsed when they realized we could reach anywhere at any time. The Mustang made several major strategic effects possible. Industrial paralysis. No German factory was safe. Production had to be scattered into small hidden sites, which were far less efficient. Transport lines were constantly cut. The already strained German economy began to fall apart completely. Fuel crisis acceleration. Synthetic fuel plants that had once been safe were now attacked again and again. This created a death spiral. Less fuel meant less training meant more combat losses, which meant even less fuel could be spared from operations for training. Tactical air supremacy. With the Luftwaffe driven from the skies, Allied ground forces could move and fight almost without fear of air attack. The breakout from Normandy, the rapid drive across France, and the crossing of the Rhine were all made possible because German forces could move only at night. Psychological collapse. The sight of American fighters over the Reich's capital destroyed the myth of German invincibility. Civilians who had been told that America was weak and far away watched silver Mustangs circle overhead with no opposition. Germany had actually begun the war with important technical advantages. The Bf 109 was arguably the world's top fighter in 1939. German pilots were superbly trained, many with combat experience from Spain. German tactics, like the finger four formation and energy fighting methods, were groundbreaking, but the Mustang was something new. It was the result of British creativity, the Merlin engine, American mass production, North American aviation using car industry methods, and constant improvement based on real combat feedback. It was not the work of one genius, but of a system that listened and adapted, the P-51D. Arriving from May 1944, included many changes driven by combat, a bubble canopy for full 360-degree vision, 6.50 caliber machine guns with better feeding, the K-14 computing gun sight, stronger wings for more ordnance, better radios, and the Packard V1650-7 engine with 1,590 horsepower. Each change answered a real problem reported by pilots. This cycle combat experience shaping fast design updates, which then improved combat performance, was something the German system, with its confused leadership and disrupted industry, could not match. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, admitted after the war, "We could design fighters equal to or better than the Mustang. The Te-152H was superior in many ways, but we could not build them in large numbers, could not fuel them reliably, and could not train pilots to use them properly." The Americans did not just build a better fighter. They built a better system for creating, producing, and using fighters. The German answer to the Mustang exposed the deep weaknesses of the Nazi system. Instead of seeing the danger and adapting, they denied it. Instead of focusing on fighters, Hitler demanded bombers. Instead of keeping experienced pilots as instructors, they flew them until they were killed. Instead of accepting hard truths, they court-martialed those who reported reality. The effect on Germany's famous aces was especially revealing. These men, with dozens or even hundreds of kills, were not only top pilots but symbols of German military glory. The Mustang era saw them destroyed one after another. Major Klaus Mietisch, 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944. He had survived 452 combat missions only to be bounced by Mustangs while forming up. Oberst Walter Ossaw, 123 victories, was shot down by P-38S on May 11, 1944. Even the older American types were becoming deadly as German pilot quality dropped. Major Hans Philipp, 206 victories, was killed by P-47s on October 8, 1943, before Mustangs arrived in strength. But his death foreshadowed what was coming. The list goes on a roll call of Germany's best flyers, cut down one by one. By the end of the war, of the 107 German pilots who had scored 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, badly wounded, or prisoners. The Mustang had not just beaten the Luftwaffe. It had wiped out its experience and tradition. As 1945 opened, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in the air. Aircraft were hidden in woods, disguised as farm buildings, or spread along roads. Pilots lived like hunted men, always moving to avoid the ever-present Mustangs. Oberst Gordon Golub, one of the few senior commanders still alive, issued orders that showed just how desperate things had become. Aircraft would take off only when enemy bombers were already overhead. Maximum sortie time was set at 15 minutes. Any pilot in the air longer than 20 minutes would be assumed to have defected. The fear of Mustangs had become so deep that many pilots aborted as soon as they heard there were escort fighters nearby. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, even though killing off experienced pilots when so few were left made no sense. Morale collapsed completely once pilots understood that even successful missions changed nothing. The bombers kept coming. The Mustangs kept escorting them, and Germany kept dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944. One victory short of becoming a century ace. His wingman reported 6 Mustangs. They came from above and behind. Heinrich never had a chance. They stayed on him, firing all the way down. Even after his aircraft was burning, they kept shooting. They wanted to be sure. This ruthlessness was new. Earlier in the war there had been some sense of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were usually not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to break off were sometimes allowed to escape. By 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends killed, knew the war was almost over, and wanted to make sure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Every dead German pilot was one less man to fly the jets or advanced fighters Germany still hoped to field. American Mustang pilots were very consistent in how they described the way the air war changed. Colonel John C. Meyer, who scored 24 victories, summed it up like this: from March to June 1944, we fought the Luftwaffe's first team experienced, aggressive, very good. From June to December, we faced their second string still dangerous, but less organized. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely hold formation, let alone fight. It wasn't satisfying. It was necessary, but tragic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commander of the 362nd Fighter Squadron, noted, "The Mustang didn't just give us range. It gave us psychological dominance." German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. We could see it in their behavior. Early on, they would attack even when outnumbered. By late 44, they broke away at the first sight of us. By 45, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported nearby. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who later broke the sound barrier, scored 11.5 victories in Mustangs. His verdict was typically blunt. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It told you what it was going to do. It had no nasty habits if you treated it right. Against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude, numbers. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't supposed to be fair. Perhaps the clearest praise came from the bomber crews whose lives depended on their escorts. Technical Sergeant William McManus, AB-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, remembered, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort turn back and know the wolves were coming. After March 44, seeing Mustangs with them all the way to the target and back, he said, was like having guardian angels. Our odds went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home. The P-51's success was not only a victory of design but also of production. North American Aviation's plants at Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, reached output levels that Germans thought impossible. At peak in 1944, North American was finishing one Mustang every 63 minutes. The assembly line, adapted from car factories, broke building work into small, specialized steps. Workers became experts at one task, achieving speed and precision far beyond traditional aircraft shop methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Inglewood, explained, "We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, men too old for the draft putting together engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war, but the system was so well organized that within weeks they were turning out perfect work. We had quality checks at every station. If something was wrong, the line stopped until it was fixed." The contrast with German production was dramatic. As Allied bombing forced factories to scatter, German aircraft were being built in caves, forests, and old mines. Parts might be made hundreds of miles apart. Real quality control was impossible. Many workers were slave laborers who had every reason to sabotage what they were forced to build. Oberst Dietrich Roebuck, who commanded several fighter units, observed, "We received new aircraft that looked fine but were death traps, control cables reversed, fuel lines that leaked, guns that would not fire." The Americans were building better aircraft in bigger numbers with workers who wanted to win. We were building worse aircraft in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose. The P-51's success over Berlin had effects far beyond Europe. It proved that air power could be projected across continents. That distance was no longer a real barrier to American force. Japan learned this lesson as American long-range fighters made possible the bombing of the home islands. Stalin noticed too. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease P-51s were impressed by their range and reliability. The Soviet Air Force began focusing on long-range escort designs, recognizing that future wars would demand the ability to project power over great distances. The VVS received about 10 P-51s for testing. They were never used in combat by Soviet units, but their influence was felt. The Mustang served long after World War II. In Korea, F-51s, the designation changed in 1948, flew close support missions. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Several air forces operated Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force retired its last F-51D in 1984. 40 years after Mustangs first flew over Berlin, but the Mustang's greatest legacy was doctrinal. It proved that air superiority was not just about controlling the air over a battlefield, but about controlling the air over an entire country. Every modern Air Force now builds its strategy around this idea. First made real when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the statistics and strategy were real people, young men, mostly in their early 20s, thrown into extreme situations. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin meant different things depending on which side they were on, but for everyone it marked a moment of deep realization. For American pilots, it was proof of concept. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We left England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin like we owned it, because we did, and flew home. 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, we own the sky over Berlin." It's hard to describe the feeling, pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we're going to win this war. For German pilots, it was despair. Feldwebel Rudy Muller of JG 302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today. American fighters over Berlin single-engine fighters. It is impossible, but I saw them with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do I tell you that I do not expect to live through this? How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong? For German civilians, it marked the end of illusion." Berliner Ursula von Kardorff wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never equal German strength. Today I watched American fighters circling above while our proud Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Everything they told us was lies. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? For Allied bomber crews, it was deliverance." Staff Sergeant James McMahon, ball turret gunner on B-17 Lucky Lady, recalled, "When we saw those Mustangs form up on us as we headed toward Berlin, I'm not ashamed to say I cried. For the first time since I began flying missions, I thought I might actually live through this war. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us." As the war drew to a close, the true scale of what the Mustang had done became obvious. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the conflict as arguably the strongest air force in the world, had been reduced to a shell. The numbers are shocking. Total Luftwaffe aircraft lost: 1,944 to 45, about 45,000. Luftwaffe pilots killed: 1,944 to 45, about 15,000. Share of Luftwaffe pilots operational on January 1, 1944, who finished the war uninjured: under 5%. German cities at least half destroyed by bombing. 6.1. German civilian deaths from bombing: 350,000 to 500,000. German industrial production lost to bombing: 35 to 40%. These figures show not only military defeat but the breakdown of an entire society. The Mustang had helped make possible a campaign that brought war to every German city, every plant, every airbase. There was no rear area, no safe zone, no rest. Hermann Göring, on trial at Nuremberg, was asked when he knew the war was lost. His answer became one of the most famous lines of the conflict: "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay, just more dead young men for no purpose." It was a strikingly honest admission from a man not known for truthfulness. But even Göring, master of self-deception, could not deny what the Mustang represented: American industrial strength joined with British engineering, projected over vast distances with relentless effectiveness. The P-51's path from first idea to Berlin escort fighter is one of the fastest and most successful aircraft development stories in history. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after North American aviation received the British request. By March 1944, less than 4 years later, it was escorting bombers over Berlin. This speed was matched by nonstop refinement based on combat results. Each variant reflected lessons learned in battle. P-51 Allison engine. Limited at high altitude, P-51BC. Packard Merlin V165-0-3. Transformed performance above 20,000 feet, P-51D bubble canopy, 6 guns, improved systems. V16507 engine, P-51H lighter, even better performance. But too late for combat in Europe. This feedback cycle combat use, shaping rapid design changes, was something the German system, crippled by political interference and bombing, could not match. German engineers built superb machines like the Tu-152H and Me-262, but they could not refine them in large-scale service or produce them in the numbers required. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin proved the entire American strategic bombing doctrine correct. Pre-war air power thinkers like Billy Mitchell and Julio Dowett had argued that bombing could win wars by destroying industry and morale, but without long-range escort, this idea remained untested. The Mustang made accurate daylight bombing practical. While the RAF continued night area bombing, the USAF could hit specific, vital targets in broad daylight ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, aircraft factories. The difference in accuracy was striking. British night bombing, on average, placed bombs within about 3 miles of the aim point. American daylight bombing with escort reduced this to about 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who later headed Strategic Air Command, stated, "The P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to choose between unbearable losses or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could systematically destroy key targets. We didn't just bomb Germany. We performed industrial surgery, cutting out its ability to wage war." The results spoke clearly. German ball-bearing output cut by 70%, aviation fuel output cut by 95%, synthetic rubber output cut by 85%, rail traffic cut by 75%, canal traffic in Western Germany wiped out entirely. This focused use of force, enabled by Mustang escorts, shortened the war by months, perhaps years. Every factory destroyed, every railway cut, every fuel depot burned meant that German forces in the field could fight less effectively. The image of Mustangs over Berlin became one of the classic pictures of World War II. Alongside the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet soldiers on the Reichstag, it symbolized American reach, technical edge, and the inevitability of Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang became a proud emblem of national industrial and scientific strength. It appeared on war bond posters, in films, and in post-war memory. The fact that it had been designed and built so quickly by a company that had never produced a fighter before fit perfectly with the American can-do story. For Germans, the Mustang stood for humiliation and defeat. Post-war German books and films often show American fighters over German cities as a visual symbol of the regime's failure to protect its people.